So earlier today, I was contemplating my prior video essay and I was feeling that familiar itch to create another one. And while I was combing over potential discussion topics in my mind that didn't already have other pre existing videos on them, the subject of Frostpaw came up. More specifically, the subject of a certain medical procedure that's performed on her. I started reading A Starless Clan pretty late. In all actuality, I only began reading it this year. I think it's a pretty solid arc, much like its predecessor for the most part, and while I would like to create videos that summarize and analyze different characters and storylines more in depth in the near future, provided that's something my audience would like to see, this video is going to be less of that and more so discussing my thoughts on one event that occurs to our aforementioned protagonist. Of course, there will be spoilers ahead for the arc A Starless Clan. In Book 4 of A Starless Clan, Thunder, Frostpaw is ambushed and mortally injured while on her trek across the moor to talk to Whistlepaw. She is left bleeding out with a deep gash in her throat. When she is found, she is taken to Smokey's barn at the horse place, where the resident two-legs there take her to a veterinarian. Her throat wound is repaired, but that's not the only procedure that's performed on her. The narrative is very clear to imply that she is also spayed during the process, both by the placement of the supposed surgical site, which is a stitched wound on her flank, also a pretty common site to utilize in order to perform an ovarian hysterectomy on a feral cat in the UK, and by both Smokey and Frostpaw's reactions to it. Frostpaw is confused as to why a two-leg would deliberately inflict another wound on her, only to repair it immediately afterward. Smokey also informs her that this is a pretty common thing to see among she-cats, as they often come back from the two-leg healer with the same wound. This particular turn of events was met with mixed reactions by the audience. Personally, while it was certainly an interesting thing to include in the narrative, I found it to be rather jarring for a number of reasons. I've seen some folks on discussion threads stating that TNRing is a common practice with feral cat populations in response to this. And while they're not wrong that it's something that commonly occurs in real life as an effort to control feral cat populations, I also believe that it's reasonable for readers to feel unsettled and put off by this happening to Frostpaw. And I personally am not comfortable shrugging it off or downplaying it as something that isn't that big of a deal. I believe there are grounds to argue that throwing realism into the mix in order to say, hey, this is actually normal and not horrifying at all, isn't something that really exactly works here. First, and this isn't news to anyone, but it's worth mentioning the anthropomorphism of the cats in this universe. We all know that these cats feel and convey human emotions, have existential thoughts about the future that no actual cat is cognitively capable of thinking, and they understand the concept of autonomy. Furthermore, the cats in this universe don't just perceive their offspring as something to instinctively protect and feed until they are weaned and self-sustaining as real-life cats do. We've seen on countless occasions the sorts of relationships these cats develop with their children and vice versa. Kids in the Warriors universe feel a sense of abandonment when one of their parents is neglecting them, be it physically or emotionally. Mothers and fathers feel a sense of parental love for their children that far exceeds what your average real-life domestic cat is capable of expressing. We even see cats grieve the idea of being unable to bear children. Squirrel Flight, or I guess Squirrel Star now, is a prime example of this. We know that she mourns the thought of being unable to carry kittens both when StarClan lies to her when informing her that she's barren in an attempt to coerce her into adopting Leafpool's kids, and when she wants to have another litter with Bramblestar, but can tell that he doesn't want them as much as she does. Not only that, but the concept of separating kittens from their mothers at 8 to 12 weeks of age, which is a very normal thing to have happen in the real world, and while it does occur in the Warrior Cats universe, it isn't a concept that's exactly welcomed in the eyes of the cats we witness the perspective of. The very idea of it is typically met with alarm or anticipatory grief. On the subject of autonomy, Twigbranch and Squirrel Flight are great examples of the fact that she-cats are in fact able to exercise it when it comes to the concept of bearing kits. Twigbranch being against the idea of kits and declining to have a litter with Finleap despite his constant pressing, alongside Squirrel Flight's aforementioned discussion with Bramblestar regarding having more kits, shows us that they decide for themselves whether they'd like to have them, and thank God for that. For a while, the question of whether or not she-cats could actively choose to bear kits upon getting a mate in the Warriors universe remained more or less unanswered. Any explanations we got were indistinct at best. Obviously, in order to keep the narrative appropriate, the biological technicalities of reproduction had to remain untouched in the books, so we never see a she-cat experience a heat cycle. But for the most part in the beginning, it seemed that upon becoming mates with someone, it was typically only a matter of time until a she-cat wound up expecting a litter. Sometimes this threw a wrench in things for certain characters, as Bluefur's pregnancy came as an unprecedented shock to her. However, as of now, it seems like that kind of sort of hazy concept has been retconned. At least that's what I'm drawing from it. We can assume that, if left intact, Frostpaw would have hypothetically eventually had the same opportunity to choose now that she is technically a warrior apprentice / refugee. We also know that, given her prior interest in Splashtail early on in her story, the idea of having a mate isn't something she was disinterested in. And unless it's canonically stated in the books that she isn't, as it stands, there is every possibility she could have also been interested in having a litter of kits later on in life. And the idea that she'd probably just end up assuming she was naturally barren after being unable to carry a litter is not much of a comfort to me, personally. Frostpaw was quite literally, forcibly, and unknowingly stripped of the sense of personal autonomy. The ability to even make this decision was taken away from her. And while that idea doesn't matter to a real-life domestic cat, it matters in this case because, in my opinion, the line between anthropomorphism and realism in the Warrior Cats universe, while it may not be very clearly defined in other aspects, it's pretty clearly defined when we are specifically talking about the concept of kitten bearing. One of the biggest reasons why this concept is so jarring to some readers is because, while we have seen this sort of thing be introduced before, it is also not something that's commonly explored in this universe. Most of the kitty pets we even come across through the eyes of the protagonists appear to be left intact, as so many of them have kits of their own. Even Smokey is an intact male. He has sired multiple litters. This also doesn't happen nearly often enough for it to not be shocking. Smokey states that it's a common occurrence, but it's not a concept we are familiarized with in the minds of the warrior cat protagonists. Yes, it was technically a concept that was briefly explained to us in the first book of the series. It's mentioned by Smudge in regards to Henry's change in behavior after his trip to the vet, and it's mentioned again by Bluestar when Rusty meets her for the first time, and she makes a comment that she can tell he's still a Tom. However, from that point onward, the concept fades from relevancy as the series progresses. I don't believe we ever encounter another cat that is actually confirmed by the narrative to be spayed or neutered. And to be clear, I'm not criticizing the authors for trying to bring something unfamiliar and interesting into the writing formula. They've done a pretty decent job of that over the past 2 arcs, and even more so with Ivypool's Super Edition. However, the way this particular event was implemented is rather disturbing, and all things considered, pretty tragic for the character in question. I would be interested to see whether or not this is something the authors just forget about, or if it's going to be something that heavily affects Frostpaw in the future. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Thank you for watching.